You don't have to tell me it's a long one. I see it started with Marx, and I already know it's going to be longer. This is from LA Progressive. Name me one country where capitalism works.
Marx argued that capitalism begins with what he called the primitive accumulation of capital, when peasants are thrown off the land. When I first considered myself a socialist revolutionary in 1970, I was hounded by free marketers' challenge. Name me one country where socialism works. These market fundamentalists would then hold up the most strident expectations for socialism. Everyone is exactly equal with no classes. There is an abundance of goods, which are conveniently circulated. Political rule is not dictatorial. All competition is banished. There are no capitalist markets. People are working together, collectively and creatively. The state has withered away. Anything less than this was proof that it didn't work.
I know this is a long one, so I have one thing. There's no capitalistic markets. There's no capitalist markets now. They're not competing with each other anymore. They've all come to an agreement, and now they're making money together, just at a higher level. They're not competing anymore. So we're not even a capitalist.
The libertarian would say, well, this isn't capitalism. This is crony capitalism. I've heard that argument.
What's crony capitalism?
Basically like social welfare capitalism, where you just give your money to business. The government gives money to business and subsidies and shit. That's not how it's supposed to work. It's supposed to work just basically off of pure competition. So that's not an actual capitalism. It's not blah, blah, blah. But that's what they expect a socialist state to do. That list was. It's not perfectly that. The right wingers will say it doesn't work. Lenin wanted to be perceived as like a worker. He's one of the few that I think that have actually done it. He just died early. Without really understanding how difficult it is to create any of these conditions when surrounded by a sea of capitalist sharks, I was first intimidated. I was driven away from examining Russia, China, and Cuba because they were authoritarian. Without realizing it, I had accepted more than one political candidate was the ultimate measuring rod. I didn't know how high the literacy rate was in socialist countries, that they had health care systems that were affordable or free, low-cost housing, free education, and there was little or no unemployment. What mattered was that there was single-party rule. I was intimidated by that argument without knowing that for the people in those countries, having two parties to vote for instead of one was not their priority. At first, an anarchist and then a council communist, I then refer to the workers' councils that existed during the Paris Commune, the Russian Revolution, and the Spanish Revolution, and say, here you are, that works. While I was right that workers' councils were a stunning achievement, the rebuttal would be, why didn't they last? At 20 years old, I didn't really have an answer for this.
Because capitalism?
Michael Prenti. A lot of this is actually about Michael Prenti and his work. So it's going to go through like, well, why didn't they? The CIA, mostly.
Because capitalism.
Because capitalism. Because we weaponized our government to serve capitalism.
Our government became a bunch of sellouts that chose to serve capitalism over the people.
10 years later, things got really bad when capitalism seemed to be restored in China in the 1980s, and when the Soviet Union fell apart 10 years later. Now I would hear the Cold War is over, capitalism has won. Writers like Francis Fukuyama would announce in his book End of History, and Samuel Huntington would crow about the glories of the West. There are at least 6 socialist tendencies on the left. Moving from right to left, the first school is social democracy. Typified by the SPD in Germany in the late 19th and 20th centuries, the Socialist Party of Debs in Yankeedom at the turn of the 20th century, and then the Social Democratic Labour Party in the power in Sweden from the 1930s to the 1970s, there are 3 varieties of Leninism, Trotskyism, and Stalinism, typified by Russia and Cuba, and Maoism, most prevalent in China from 1949 to 1976. Then there are small grouplets of council communists who are prevalent during the Russian and Spanish revolutions, and among the Dutch and Germans. Lastly, anarchism was prevalent during the Russian and Spanish revolutions and in Rojava today. The criticism that capitalists usually make of socialism is really only of the Stalinist or Maoist version. They are also the only types of socialism that ever succeeded in defeating the bourgeoisie, at least for a while, and built powerful and in many regards extraordinary nations. Well, it has been 30 years since the fall of communism, 30 years in which capitalists could show the world why Margaret Thatcher was right when she said there is no alternative. No more communist menaces to gum up the free market. What do we have? What do capitalists have to show for the world after their so-called victory? Adam Smith, in his time seen, like many of his peers, as a moral philosopher trying to discover the maximum social good, is considered by capitalists to be their founding father. His criteria for a highly functioning capitalist society is a high standard of living, not just for the elites, but for the middle classes, the working classes, and gradually the poor. A decrease in the amount of work done because of high technology, opportunities for everyone to start a small business who wants to, and a relatively stable economic life. No reason for wars because the invisible hand of the market would benefit all countries and make fighting over resources a thing of the past. The purpose of this article is to assess what capitalism has done. The books I'll be referring to are Introduction to Political Economy by Zachary Schneider and Knoedler, David Harvey's The 17 Contradictions and the End of Capitalism, Michael Roberts' The Long Depression, Michael Parenti's Black Shirts and Reds, and Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine. Capitalism has always existed. One of the first things you'll be told about capitalism is that it has always existed. This is claimed by Adam Smith as well as the neoclassical economists. This is hardly the case for the entire school of Marxists and the economic institutionalists, who will tell you that capitalism is roughly 500 years old. In addition, no anthropologist will agree that tribal societies or even agricultural civilizations like Egypt, Mesopotamia, China, or India had purely capitalist economic exchanges within their societies. Even external trade cannot be characterized as capitalist. The merchants in these civilizations were given lists of goods to buy by their temple administrators. They did not truck, barter, and exchange independently of the ruling elite. Capitalism commences when hardworking, thrifty, shrewd capitalists take risks. Smith claims that capitalism starts when frugal, hardworking, shrewd traders identify a need and invest capital in land, good, or services. In the best of all possible worlds, the product sells and the budding capitalist makes a profit. This capitalist has to compete with other traders, and the results of this competition are better products for everyone. Smith called this process the invisible hand of the market. Today, Smith might be surprised to find out that the wealth capitalists possessed was less than the result of personal ingenuity, but more based on inheritance. Last time I checked, about 2/3 of capitalists got their wealth from the inheritance they received. Marxists and post-Keynesians contest that the origin of capitalism begins with trade. Marx argued that capitalism begins with what is called the primitive accumulation of capital, when peasants are thrown off the land to create enclosures, and their tools and animals are taken away from them. The capitalist uses the land for commercial farming, growing coffee, sugar, cotton, and tobacco, which are tended by slaves. Meanwhile, former peasants are driven to work in cities and eventually in factories the capitalists built in the 19th century. Michael Perelman, in his book The Invention of Capitalism, describes how Smith papered over the primitive accumulation process. Specialization of labor is justified because it produces high volume of cheap projects.
Cheap projects include cheap items. They don't make things last anymore either. He's talking about capitalism being the reason for better quality products that will last, but that's not the case.
You got plastic shit now. So innovative, guys.
Every vacuum cleaner we have ever bought has always died. But we know people with vacuum cleaners from 70s, 60s, from the 30s that are still fucking going.
We have just a bunch of shit from the 90s. We're poor as fuck. And all the shit works.
Can't tell you how many both of our TVs have been beaten up. Adam Smith was sensitive to the cost the specialization of labor might have on the body and mind of the worker that resulted in alienation on the job. Despite that, he felt that the volume of goods that would result from specialization was worth that cost. If capitalists today wish to have a stable, satisfied workforce, they would pay attention to what factory work does to workers. The most obvious effect of alienating conditions on the worker is that as a class, working class men die on average at about 67 to 72 years of age, which is at least 7 years earlier than middle class men and women. That's 7 years of lost labor and the training of labor for capitalists. Workers are lazy and need a carrot to motivate them. Capitalists imagine that people are generally stupid, unmotivated, and short-sighted, and it is only the few, heroic, risk-taking capitalists who show creativity and ingenuity. Most people that are capitalists and have a lot of money are actually very fucking stupid. Not smart. But capitalists...
You know, things are pretty easy when you're born on the 90-yard line.
Oh, the silver spoon.
Mm-hmm.
But capitalists take how workers behave in their leisure time after they are exhausted from 50 hours a week or more of work as their point of departure. These workers do want to cool out, sleep, watch a ball game, or get drunk. But capitalists pay no attention to the fact that workers will work on their cars, build engines, and create all kinds of crafts in their free time without being paid at all. Capitalists also ignore the fact that in cases when workers have control of what, how, and when they produce, as in worker self-management or worker cooperative experiments, they have higher rates of productivity than they do when working for a capitalist. Competition between capitalists leads to better products and lower costs. You got that backwards, bro.
These are the things he's debunking.
And it's more like higher costs and worse products.
That's the incentive, is to cut corners and make the cheapest product possible, whether it works, whether it lasts or not.
Oh, so Boeing really is the most American company there is.
Sadly, maybe.
Actually, I would say Dollar General probably kills smaller businesses more often than Walmart.
Yeah.
There's not a Walmart in Podunk nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
There's a fucking Dollar General. You better believe there's a Dollar General.
Dollar General's a money pit.
No. Adam Smith believed that the fruits of competitive capitalism would lead to lower prices for consumers. This is not what has happened. Competition between capitalists leads to a concentration of capital in a few corporations and the elimination of smaller capitalists. As Marxists Barron and Sweezy point out, corporate capitalists agree not to engage in cutthroat competition, and the prices of commodities are pretty much the same. Corporations compete through advertising, not on the prices themselves. The state is minimally necessary in the orchestration of capitalism. State intervention was extremely important in helping to get the United States out of the Depression through the New Deal programs. Furthermore, today, the lack of state intervention is directly connected to the amplification and spreading of COVID-19. Furthermore, today the lack of state intervention is directly connected to the amplification and spreading of COVID-19 because there has been no national plan developed at the federal level. Additionally, the professed but rarely implemented ideology of patriotism notwithstanding, capitalists are globalists, and they need the state to intervene in the process of both subordinating workers in colonized countries and attacking and overthrowing governments who do not want to hand over all their natural resources to foreign corporations. Capitalists require a visible fist to work hand and glove with the invisible hand. The abundance of goods and services is what justifies capitalist profits. In Adam Smith's time, making a profit on material or consumer goods was the only way to make a profit. However, after World War II, capitalists realized that there were great profits to be made on war industries, and that it was far less risky. In addition, with the rise of the banks in the 20th century, it was profitable to make money based on the speculation of stocks and bonds. This means that today, capitalists are far more interested in making a profit in defense of spending and stock market speculation than investing in commodities or building infrastructures. The fickle moods of the spending public are too dangerous to invest in on their own. So too, profits made on infrastructure is too slow a turnaround time to wait for. This is the reason Yankeedom, it's so funny, Yankeedom has trillions of dollars of infrastructural work that sits waiting. One problem for capitalists is the profits made on the military destroying productive forces, and the wealth made on paper transactions produces no social wealth. Yet both are counted as profits along with the real wealth based on selling goods and services. The result is a society whose profit claims are wildly exaggerated if wealth is judged the way Adam Smith thought best. The wealth of capitalists will have a trickle down effect on workers. I remember that.
Reaganomics.
The bad thing about capitalism is that it's selfishness. It's more about how much money I can make and not whether or not you'll live to work another day.
It's just short-sighted, short-term.
Very short-sighted, I would say, or people would care more about all the toxic waste that they dump into the rivers and stuff. If people thought more on a global scale or on a long-term scale, like a after I am gone, my children's children type scale, then the world would be a much better place. Because then we'd be trying to preserve something instead of just How much money can I make in the time that I'm
like I'm 80 years old and I don't care about anyone except me.
Well, if you're 80 years old, you probably are at the top of the bar because people below you make it to 67 to 72. So you're 80 years old sitting back like, I made it to 80 and all those fuckers under me, thousands of people, they all died 12 years prematurely.
And you owe all your success to their exploitation.
You think anyone's going to be holding Trump's hand?
Probably.
Yeah, Melania's going to be over there like trying to fucking put kinks in his fucking IV or something. Roughly 50 years ago, Yankeedom was rated around 5th in the world in the steepness of its stratification system. Today, it's number 1. The standard of living for the average working class person today is nowhere near what it was in 1970. The average work week is at minimum 10 hours longer. One of the clearest indicators of the decline in the standard of living is the amount of debt working class people have been accumulating over the past 50 years. This is because their wages or salaries cannot keep up with the cost of living. Capitalism works for all social classes. Capitalism has never worked for people in poverty, which over the last 70 years has fluctuated between 10% and 20%. Capitalism in America and then gradually in Western Europe has worked for white working class people within a window of time between 1948 and 1970. That was an anomaly caused by the devastation of industrial capacity and financial ruin in most nations during World War II, which made the U.S. the world's chief center of production for consumer and capital goods. Since then, it has ceased to benefit white working class people. Since the crash of 2008, political economist Richard Wolff has said that those who have benefited from capitalism are the upper middle class, 10%, the upper class, 5%, and the ruling class, 1%. Actually, the actual ruling class is far more concentrated than 1% of the population, an arbitrary figure chosen by the Occupy Wall Street activists for the sake of expedient propaganda. A more realistic estimate is between 0.2 and 0.01% of the total population. As of today, capitalism works for less than 20% of the population. Capitalism shrinks racial tensions because it doesn't pay to exclude skilled workers. It just pays to pay them differently because they're a marginalized group. Or threaten to have them sent back to their country like Trump did a lot of his people. This is the argument made by neoclassical economist Gary Becker. Judging from the behavior of Trump followers, the militarization of the police and the number of racial minorities killed by the police or in prison, race relations have gotten worse than they were 60 years ago.
Far from refining their work skills to compete with the white prison workers, minorities work for slave wages. The lack of class mobility for working class whites and minorities has inflamed race relations as many working class whites have blamed minorities, including illegal immigrants, for a decline in their standard of living. A far better explanation for inflamed race relations is that capitalists benefit from racial competition for jobs by a divide and conquer strategy. By paying white workers a little more, by keeping a pool of unemployed minorities available to work in order to keep wages low, and undermine strikes by white working class workers. This is part of the army of the unemployed mentioned in Marxist literature, never quite eliminated by the capitalists since it acts as a wage depressant and facilitates working class docility. There are no significant capitalist downturns, it's just the oscillation of business cycles. Michael Roberts, in his book The Long Depression, names 4 major capitalist crises: the Long Depression of the 1870s, the Great Depression of the 1930s, the Great Recession of the 1970s, and the Great Financial Crisis of 2007, which we are still in. For Roberts, when there is a recovery, it is not truly a recovery in that it returns us to previous levels. It starts at a lower level. The concept of business cycles is a flat denial of long-term irreversible capitalist crisis. Economics can be best understood by separating it from politics. Neoclassical economics, unlike Adam Smith, imagine that economic exchanges can be understood as separate from politics. This completely ignores all the money capitalists invest in controlling their political parties. William Donhoff, in his book Who Rules America and the Powers That Be, researched all the mediating institutions that influence both the Republican and Democratic parties long before the population actually votes. These mediating organizations include universities, foundations, think tanks, policy campaigns, news dissemination, book publications, and lobbyists. Capitalists absolutely need to be in control of politics in order to control the state's domestic and foreign policies. The invisible hand, the pursuit of individual self-interest, leads to economic order. The Yankee population satisfies their self-interest by driving their big cars and paying their taxes to a military that is the world's greatest polluter. The collective result is extreme weather and fires. Another example is that some people find it convenient to not wear masks during the pandemic while others do wear them. Each produces what seems to be in the short-term self-interest, but the result is an expansion of the virus, the loss of work, and the shutting down of small businesses. The invisible hand in the present leads to a long-term collective disaster. People have unlimited individual wants and needs, and the market scurries to satisfy them all. The consumer is king. If this were true, there would be no need for advertising. Through advertising, wants are artificially created and then are turned into perceived needs. Many actual wants are neglected if the rate of profit on them is too low. Planned obsolescence makes sure that products don't last too long. Economics is a science. If neoclassical economics were a science, it would have an agreed-upon explanation for the causes of previous depressions and would predict what is likely to happen in the future. Mainstream economics is propaganda for a particular school of economics, neoclassical economics. The use of mathematical formulas does not make neoclassical economics a science. It only obscures all the myths that we have been challenging. The size of the income is directly proportional to contributions to production, and choosing work over leisure, income is hardly proportional to contributions to production. In this case of doctors, architects, or lawyers, this may be true. Conversely, there are jobs that are highly dangerous, that have low compensation. Working class exposure to hazardous waste is an example. On the other hand, the salaries of those in the insurance industry, real estate, and finance is completely disproportionate to the goods and services they actually produce. Poverty and unemployment are linked to bad individual choices between leisure and work. Unemployment is a necessary part of the capitalist system. An unemployed army of workers is necessary to keep workers from working together and joining unions to raise wages and better their working conditions. Many workers are in poverty not because they choose to stay home, watch TV, and play poker. The choice of workers is between working at various kinds of low-wage jobs or starving. That's what we were talking about, how it's so hard to change your stars because they keep you have to work so much, everything costs so much, and if you don't work, you starve. So you can't possibly go to any other venture or like take a risk or anything because you don't have anything.
And that's probably why a lot of people in the lower class honestly don't care that much about what's happening in Palestine, because they're just trying to figure out how to put food on their table for that evening. They don't have time to worry about, like another country or somewhere else in the world. So like under those circumstances, I understand. And yeah, that's why there's not a revolution, because if you keep your boot on people's throat, and if they do step up and you make sure that they lose their job, then who's left to fight?
Yeah, and you look at all this bullshit is going on, and then you look at the duopoly and you know it's hopeless.
It's because the people that see it are the very people that still don't have time to go to the rallies. They still don't have time to join a cause.
Or even time to go vote because their
work doesn't pay them for it and gives them a bunch of shit for...
You can't take the time away from work to do a damn thing because you need the money. Mm-hmm. Causes of downturns are externalities, bad crops, bad weather. Neoclassical economists deny that there are any built-in problems intrinsic to the capitalist economy. It is claimed that externalities such as bad weather or crop failure can be overcome by changes in monetary policy. But in this externalities claim, neoclassical economists are in the vast minority. Marxians, post-Keynesians, and Keynesians all agree that downturns are internal to the capitalist system. Keynes said downturns are due to the inadequate spending by capitalists on infrastructure and wages. Wages are too low for workers to buy products off the shelf. Institutionalists like Thorstein Veblen would say that the problem is in the gap between industrial wealth and the pecuniary wealth. Michael Hudson would say that the crises are due to the accumulating bubble between finance and industrial capital. Marxians like Michael Roberts and Anwar Sheikh say crisis is due to the tendency of the rate of profit to fall.
I just want to point out one thing. Understand that like a lot of the generic products that you buy to try to save money is made by the same company as the brand name. So like brand name Hershey's chocolate chips and Great Value chocolate chips are made at the same Hershey factory. So it's not even a competition. They're competing with themselves because they can make the same product, and maybe the chips that don't make it to the bag, they throw them, kind of like your leftover, your cigarette crumbs. They throw it into the Great Value bag, and they still get you to buy their product at a lower cost, but they don't have to lose that cost to anyone else. So there's no competition. And understand that that is the same case with, as well, like drug manufacturers, for example, when their patent runs up, they will quickly establish a generic of the same medication so that they can compete with other companies that will actually release it at a legitimate lower cost. So it's the same thing. You're not, you need, it's hard to say because people have to buy cheap regardless, but just understand that they are doing those little things to prove that capitalism does not fucking work.
And even these discount low-cost stores like the Dollar Tree, the amount you're buying is actually more expensive than if you would just buy the actual product, because they give you much smaller products, very, very small amount. You're still paying more. You're just buying a very little amount.
Well, but the problem with that is that's, again, poor. That's
the choice you have, and a little amount's better than no amount.
You can pay $1 for some toothpaste, but you can't pay $6 for some toothpaste.
For a big tub of toothpaste that would last you longer.
Yeah, it's buying in bulk kind of situation. You have to have money to save money. You have to have money to make money. Because the bottom line of capitalism is money. The only thing is that there's not that competition consumer marketplace there was supposed to be.
People think I'm a fucking idiot. I've not done anything in my life. Give me $1 billion. I will do a lot with it. I've played fucking video games. You give me a bunch of money and do shit. I can do shit. Like, I don't know. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't. You're not fucking some special person if you're born with a bunch of money. You know what I mean? You
just won the lottery.
You won the birthing lottery. Congratulations. You're a nepo baby.
Yeah, that's all there is to it.
Capitalism appeals to rationality and is the opposite of fascism. As it turns out, there is an invisible fist of fascism behind the invisible hand. Apologists of capitalism treat fascism as having nothing to do with capitalism. They would say it was just a spontaneous eruption of irrationality as a result of the existence of conflicts within mass society. In fact, capitalists have been very friendly to fascists, both before and after World War II, and continue to be so today. Franz Neumann has argued that fascism is a product of monopoly, finance, capital. Fascism provides a simplistic outlet for some working-class whites and large numbers of small business owners who are being crushed by large corporations. The outlet is to blame religious or racial minorities for their problems rather than the capitalists. Michael Parenti tells us that in Germany, the greatest source of Hitler's wealth was a secret slush fund to which the leading German industrialists regularly contributed. Fascism in Germany was favorably looked on in Yankeedom. Henry Ford traveled to Rome to pay homage to and strike economic deals with Mussolini. Mussolini was hailed by the press in Yankeedom throughout the 1920s and 1930s, including Fortune magazine, the Wall Street Journal, the Saturday Evening Post, the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, and the Christian Science Monitor. They hailed Mussolini as a bearer of order to Italy. Newspaper giant William Randolph Hart instructed his correspondents in Germany to only 5 positive reports about Hitler's regime. Germany to only file positive reports about Hitler's regime. They even opened their columns to the occasional writings of major Nazi leaders like Alfred Rosenberg and Hermann Göring. During the early war years, Western capitalist states were also cooperating with fascism. The English Prime Minister Chamberlain was on very good terms with Hitler, and like many members of the ruling class, saw fascism as a defense against communism.
How dare we let people be happy? Let's stop that.
When the workers have power, it means they have less power, less money. The Rockefellers' Chase Manhattan Bank used its Paris office in France to launder German money to facilitate Nazi trade during the war. Corporations like DuPont, Ford, General Motors, and ITT owned factories in enemy territories that produced fuel, tanks, and planes. Pilots were given instruction not to hit factories that were owned by U.S. firms, including those that produced military equipment for the Nazis. See Charles Hingham's Trading with the Enemy for more. Holy shit, I didn't fucking know that.
I mean, I like how Bayer is not mentioned in there.
Oh.
In case you don't know, Bayer, who makes baby aspirin, also made the gas that kills.
They're a German company, though.
They are a German company.
Yeah. These are American companies. Fucking built shit there and produced stuff for them. Well, and then we're told, there are fucking people were told not to bomb them in Germany. What the fuck? What the fuck?
I am actually not surprised. I'm not surprised that we gave weapons to Nazis. It explains why we delayed joining the war for so long, even while
we're profiteering on both sides.
Yeah, well, that's what we usually do. And then we figured out okay, if we start smaller wars in countries nobody cares about, then we don't have to worry about it. We can still facilitate both sides. But then, this thing called TikTok happened. And
evil as hell.
Capitalism. It is evil. Capitalism is evil. Why at any point in time would you decide that $1 is more important than a human life? Unless that human life has been an absolute waste, as in a serial murder a serial child rapist, somebody named Netanyahu.
Within a year after the war, almost all Italian fascists were released from prison while the communists who fought the fascists languished in prison. According to Parenti, under the protection of the Yankee occupation authorities, the police, the courts, military, security agencies, and bureaucracy remained largely staffed by those who had served the former fascist regimes. After World War II, the United States brought the top military and scientists from fascist Germany to the United States to work for them.
I was about to say something about that.
C. Martin Lee's The Beast Reawakens for more on this. Between 1945 and 1975, the Yankee rulers helped to keep fascism afloat in Italy, supplying $75 million to right-wing organizations in Italy.
That's a lot for back then, too.
Their modernization process is inevitably good for all societies. Modernization theory divided modern societies into Western Europe and the United States, and the rest were traditional societies. Fascist and communist societies were excluded from the category of modernization. Traditional societies, tribal and agricultural societies, were seen as economically and technologically backward, superstitious, and driven by irrational customs. Modernization theorists believe modernization would improve traditional societies. In fact, modernization is relatively good for Western Europe and the United States core. Modernization theory ignores the fact that an increasing number of traditional societies have been colonized, and this is the reason for the lack of material resources. Andre Gunder Frank's book, The Capitalism and Underdevelopment in Latin America, demonstrates this. Nation-states are autonomous from each other, and whether their country is wealthy or poor depends on the economic policies of that country.
It depends on what policies we establish.
That's what they claim. Capitalism is a global system that is far more powerful than any individual nation-state. Capitalism constantly needs new markets and imperialistically exploits countries on the periphery in the core states' quest for cheap land, natural resources, and labor. Nation-states are independent. Interdependent, sorry. Western societies have created a model for modernization because of something inherent to them. There is nothing in the inherent makeup of Western societies that makes them more suitable for modernization. It is true that Western societies developed capitalism first because their adequate rainfall and mountainous terrain made it unnecessary to develop an unitary empire based on centralized irrigation system. Merchants were not beholden to emperors or kings as in the great agricultural civilizations, but that was happenstance and had nothing to do with any imminent European miracle. Western European societies developed capitalism without any pressure or colonization from other parts of the world. Countries outside of Western Europe that are striving to modernize have to overcome their history of colonization by Western societies. Furthermore, it is difficult to develop a scientific and engineering base. Many of these colonized nations are in debt and beholden to the IMF and World Bank of loans. These banks do not want colonized countries to develop an independent scientific base because those scientists and engineers might develop a resource base that is separate and might make the resource bases of the West obsolete. Economic history and cross-cultural economics are not very important. Since neoclassical economists like to think that capitalism has always existed, they tend to play down the history of European economic systems. They are also not very aware of the comparative economic systems of tribal societies or agricultural states. Both the study of history and other cultures from around the world give a relatively to the current capitalist system that works against its propaganda. International trade benefits all nations, theory of comparative advantage. In her book, The Shock Doctrine, Naomi Klein identifies the Chicago Boys as initiating the economics of Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Poland, Russia, South America, Africa, and Iraq for the glories of market fundamentalism. Was the result that Adam Smith would have expected? Was the result what Adam Smith would have expected? Hardly. These economies had their social safety nets decimated. Conditions for workers resulted in insecure jobs, lower income, longer hours, and growing debt to the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. They were given loans for the support of the tourist industry, growing cash crops rather than the substance, or taking care to develop industries that were most efficient in developing the natural resources in their own country.
History has proven that capitalism works and socialism is a failure. This assessment is purely propaganda. When a neoclassical economist picks a capitalist society, it picks the most favorable example, such as the United States in the 1960s or Germany in the 1990s. It fails to acknowledge that since most of the world is capitalist, this includes authoritarian capitalist dictatorships that exist in many parts of the world, especially the so-called capitalist periphery, places such as Indonesia, ruled by military tyrants and oligarchic cliques beholden to foreign interests. These dictators were installed by core capitalists, America. These dictators were installed by core capitalists to represent rebellion. Conversely, when a neoclassical economist picks a socialist country, it usually refers to the worst time periods in Russia, China, Cuba, Venezuela, or North Korean history. In defense of Leninist communism. I am not a Leninist, but since capitalists insist that Leninism is the only kind of socialism, Leninism is worth defending. To do this, I will be guided by Michael Parenti's book, Black Shirts and Reds. One of the things Parenti points out is that capitalists make unfalsifiable claims, putting state socialist countries in the position of damned if you do, damned if you don't. For example, if Soviets refused to negotiate a point, they were intransient and belligerent. Lol. If they appeared willing to make concessions, this was a skillful ploy to put us off our guard. By opposing arms limitations, they would have demonstrated their aggressive intent, but when in fact they supported most armament treaties, it was because they were mendacious and manipulative. If the churches in the USSR were empty, this demonstrated that religion was suppressed. But if the churches were full, this meant the people rejected the regime's atheistic ideology. If the workers went on strike, this was evidence of their alienation from the collective system. If they didn't go on strike, this was because they were intimidated and lacked freedom. At least they didn't try to say they were happy. A scarcity of consumer goods demonstrated the failure of the economic system. An improvement in consumer supplies meant only that the leaders were attempting to placate a restive population, pages 41 and 42. So, in other words, capitalists fell to state the conditions in which they could be proven wrong. The performance of socialist states must be compared to the political economy of the country before socialism came to power. What is not considered by capitalists in challenging socialist institutions is those countries that became socialist societies were far worse off before socialism arrived. So, for example, whatever the shortcomings of the state, socialism under Leninist, Stalinist, Maoist rule in Russia, China, and Cuba must be seen against what life was like for workers and peasants under Tsarist Russia, China under Chiang Kai-shek, or Cuba under Batista. Other countries were subjected to the miseries of colonial rule by the West before becoming socialists. Relative to those conditions, socialism in those countries was a clear improvement. For Cuba, improvements in housing, schools, literacy, sanitation, health clinics, jobs, human services, life expectancy. And speaking of Cuba, Michael Parenti writes, "For all its mistakes and abuses, the Cuban Revolution brought sanitation, schools, health clinics, jobs, housing, and human services to a level not found throughout most of the Third World and in many parts of the First. Life expectancy rose from 55 to 75, a 20-year jump. Understand that's a pretty big jump in life expectancy to now think that you're going to live 20 extra years. It's pretty big. Imagine if we did that. Imagine if our life expectancy in America was 87 to 92. That'd be cool. That'd be cool. Well, not really, because then your bodies start breaking down. You just want to die anyway.
Old people need to die.
Well, old people want to die.
It's your time.
I support late life abortions. So you get your 60s, your 20s, your 30s, whatever you want to do. Life expectancy rose from 55 to 75. Smallpox, malaria, tuberculosis, typhoid, polio, and numerous other diseases have been wiped out by improved living standards. Free Palestine. Cuba has enjoyed a level of literacy higher than the US. The Cuban Revolution has sent teachers, doctors, and workers to dozens of third world countries without charging a penny. We wouldn't even give the patent for the COVID-19 virus or vaccination. Vaccination. Yeah, I'm just saying, like, we don't do shit for free. What's your name? Israel. It is the country with the most teachers and doctors per capita of all countries. Most third world capitalist regimes are far more oppressive. In Russia, within 30 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, the Soviets made industrial advances equal to what capitalism took a century to accomplish. oh, so if we work together and we let people do things that they want to do, I mean, they're going to come up with great inventions and innovations that could leap our society forward as a whole in a lot more, or in a faster time frame than if we were to, let's say, suppress someone who was interested in making those advances.
Yeah, imagine if we operated like on anything other than a profit motive.
I can't, because like even myself, everything I do, I think about,
as an American, like everything you do has to be monetized.
Like how much more work do I have to do to afford this, or how much time can I afford to take off, or can I afford to take my vacation, or can I afford to take my sick days? And it's just, even at the lowest level, we're stuck thinking about money, and it's just not something we want to. I don't want to be concerned about money. I don't want to be concerned about going to a hospital. I don't want to refuse an ambulance if I'm injured, but can't afford any of it. So it's like, the fuck. In communist countries, there was less economic inequality than under capitalism. Paranetti continues. The perks enjoyed by party and government elites were modest by corporate CEO standards and the West, as was their personal incomes and lifestyles. Soviet leaders live in large apartments in a large housing project near the Kremlin, set aside for government leaders. The income spread between the highest and lowest earner in the Soviet Union was about 5-1. In the US, the spread is 10,000-1. There is guaranteed education. You don't have that here. Guaranteed employment. We don't have that here. Guaranteed housing and medical assistance.
We don't have that here.
We love it when our veterans live on the streets and don't get any help. It's one of our favorite things. Black shirts and reds, page 45. The fall of the Soviet Union had a negative impact on the revolutionary movements all over the world. With capitalist fundamentalism having taken over Russia, that meant that any liberation struggles on the capitalist periphery were on their own. In the past, they had received aid from Russia and its allies in the Soviet sphere of influence, such as Eastern Germany and Poland. In addition, capitalists would no longer have to convince workers or national leaders of liberation movements that they offered a better way of life than communism. They seemed to make the only game in town.
They seemed to be the only game in town.
They seemed to be the only game in town.
Imminent criticisms of Leninism. Why the standard of living is not higher and political governance less democratic. It must be said that all socialist countries are not free upgrades for the living standards of their production in a timely way. All socialist countries are under constant attack from capitalist countries and have to devote a great deal of their economy to building up their military. All this is revenue taken away from domestic infrastructure projects and consumer goods. Additionally, socialist states have to be extremely cautious in both setting up their political systems and holding elections. Capitalists will do everything they can to overthrow socialism as a system, as well as the socialist leaders. Given the record of the CIA attempting to overthrow roughly 60 governments since its inception, socialist revolutionaries have good reason for being cautious and less willing to have elections resembling a free-for-all. Yet, there were a number of difficulties that seemed inherent to the system itself.
Attempting to overthrow roughly 60 governments. So how many did we successfully overthrow since we've attempted 60?
We just know about the 60.
So what, we successfully did 59?
I don't.
I'm just saying, like,
well, we tried.
I like the wording, like attempted 60. Yeah, why do we have terrorists, guys? I wonder. Maybe because our leaders that we vote in represent us as a whole, and representing us as a whole, it's murdering people of a different nation and country just in an attempt to get their resources a little bit cheaper than what we can get somewhere else.
Despite his sympathy for Russia, Parenti is no true believer. He says the eccentricities of the revolutionary survival did not make it inevitable. The heartless execution of hundreds of old Bolshevik leaders, the suppression of party political life through terror or peer pressure, the eventual silencing of debate regarding the pace of industrialization and collectivization, the ideological regulation of all intellectual and cultural life, the mass deportation of suspect nationalities.
Hey, that's what we're trying to do.
What?
Deport everyone that's not of our nationality.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we just seem to appear that way. We don't mind that actually they come and work. Because we get to pay them less and everything.
I'm sorry. You need to correct that.
Or
you mean the hires up actually don't care if they come at work. They just want to say that they are mad because they want the white people to think that they're coming to take our jobs, so we don't focus on the fact that they're the ones fucking us over.
Yeah, exactly. In his book, Inventing Reality, Parenti admits The truth is, in the USSR, there exists a serious problem of labor productivity, industrialization, urbanization, bureaucracy, corruptions, and alcoholism. There are production and distribution bottlenecks, plant failures, consumer scarcities, criminal abuses of power, and suppression of dissidents. Sounds like a lot of human error. Limits of centralized planning. Parenti points out that the centralized planning in some historical periods is better than others. Central planning was useful and even necessary in an earlier period of siege socialism to produce steel, wheat, and tanks to build an industrial base and withstand the Nazi onslaught, but it eventually hindered technological development and growth. No system could gather and process the immense range of detailed information needed to correct decisions about millions of production tasks.
All you had to do was have the companies be built by a U.S. representative and they wouldn't bomb your area.
See, my biggest criticism of the USSR, of Mao, and of Cuba is that all workplaces should have been democratized by the workers. That is the essence of socialism, and to miss that, to miss that point of it, makes me confused. And
maybe they didn't get a chance.
uh,
Killed beforehand.
maybe somebody can tell me I'm wrong or something. Had they tapped the collective creative energy of the workers and included them in the planning process via worker councils, things might have been different.
There it is.
Yeah. Disincentives for innovation. Managers were little inclined to pursue technological paths that might lead them to their own obsolescence. Managers received no rewards for taking risks. Experimentation increased the chances one might miss their quotas. Improvements in production would lead only to an increase in one productive quota. In effect, well-run factories were punished with greater workloads. They still are.
That's why they tell you as a worker to never put your 100% in at work, because then they're going to expect your 100% every day.
125% tomorrow. And every day after that.
Yep.
There would be deliberate slowdowns so as not to surpass the quotas, or they would work faster, finish the job in 4 to 6 hours, and go somewhere to work for extra money. High-priced quality goods and luxury items were hard to come by. All this affected work performance. Why work hard to earn more when there was not that much to buy? There was strong resentment concerning consumer scarcities, the endless shopping lines, and housing shortages. Greater affluence rather than political democracy mattered usually. There were relatively prosperous craftsmen, small entrepreneurs, well-educated engineers, architects, and intellectuals that were the most aggressive about becoming richer. It was this desire for greater affluence rather than the quest for political freedom that motivated most of those who immigrated to the West. Signs of structural collapse. In my article, Like a Rowboat in a Typhoon, I've identified 12 crises that faced Western capitalism. Each crisis was either there before the 1990 breakup of the Soviet Union and has continued to become worse during the next 30 years of the free reign of market fundamentalism, or the crisis is new and the result of neoliberal economic policies.
COVID-19 has expanded rather than leveled off because the nation state is not allowed to have a national plan, since that is against the ideology of neoliberal economics. Local states are left to fend for themselves, and the results are an incoherent mess. Large parts of the Yankee population, full of rugged individualism, are in denial there even is a pandemic. They're ignoring what scientists say and are speculating the virus and are spreading the virus as they dance together in clubs and on beaches. Other countries have risen to the occasion with half the resources. Socialist countries like Cuba, China, Venezuela, and North Vietnam have responded well and admirably. Extreme weather is a very serious problem that has been building for 50 years, if not longer, but it's become especially obvious in the last 20 years. There's no long-term plan to address this problem either. Every year we have record-breaking heat in the summer, along with fires, and in the winters, record cold spells in the east and north-central states. Glaciers are melting and water is rising. Has the absence of the Soviet Union unleashed market forces to solve this extreme weather problem? No. Yeah, and the reaction to the pandemic makes me have high hopes for all the viruses that are melting from the permafrost.
Or the climate refugee crisis. We're not going to take anyone in. A lot of these other Western countries aren't either. So when it's too hot to live in the South anymore and they all start going up north, it's going to be a bloodbath. I don't know what's going to happen.
Police departments have turned into state terrorist organizations which have been gathering more and more weapons for the last 50 years. There is no structural reform as the police are handed bloated budgets while they are trained to mutilate and kill as a matter of course. Now that neoliberal capitalism does not have to worry about communism, have they reined in the police? Is it a new day for racial minorities to enjoy the blessings of the free market as its minority citizenry? Far from it. The problems of the police have only gotten worse. There is open rebellion against police terror, which the ruling class has failed to address structurally. Besides police attacks, there is the prison industrial complex filled with a disproportionate number of minorities, many in for minor crimes. Any claim for reparation for minorities is like spitting in the wind. This has gotten even worse since the killing of Oscar Grant in Oakland in 2011. Since 1990, when the capitalists thought they won, things have gotten worse. Kamala Harris refused to let nonviolent prisoners out because capitalists who have invested in prison labor need the workers. As market fundamentalism triumphed since 1990, given the working class and small business owners a better life? The answer is still a resounding no. In fact, it has attracted them to fascism. Openly armed fascistic groups publicly wave Confederate flags and white power signs. We know better than to think these groups originated with Trump. To know they just thought that they could talk more.
Yeah, they just felt safer to come out about it.
Well, if their president was racist, then they could be too. With its policy mantra of austerity at home and abroad, it is more likely that white working class people and small business owners will continue to be drawn to fascism with or without Trump. Their economic circumstances have deteriorated particularly since 2008, especially because of the absence of socialist alternatives here. We are in the worst capitalist crisis in history because the coronavirus has crippled the physical economy. Political economist Jack Rasmus says the real unemployment rate is between 25 and 30%. Those who are working at reduced workloads. Consumer spending is very low. Both parties sing a capitalist tune that workers might die so the economy can live. This is an economic policy. This is what capitalists say we can look forward to with its happy victory over socialism. For Adam Smith, capitalist wealth was based on building infrastructures, goods, and services, and making life easier for the lower classes. Free market fundamentalists since 1990 have continued to ignore these things. After 1970, financial capital got increasingly out of control. Has the absence of the Soviet Union allowed neoclassical economists to rein in the banks? Fat chance. Today, fictitious capital greatly outstrips industrial capital in terms of its claim on social wealth. The banks were responsible for the crash in 2008. And the government decided to bail them out because they said something along the lines that if the banks go under, we all go under, and blah, 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 blah.
That was Obama. He should have prosecuted them all.
Yeah, well. I'm sure he made money off of it.
I think Chase or somebody picked his whole fucking cabinet, so what a fucking sellout. Citibank picked his cabinet. So
that's not any better. The ruling class made a decision shortly after World War II that more stable, bigger profits could be made from the military than investing in commodities. After all, we had to defend ourselves against the Cold War nemesis, the Soviet Union, that wants world communism. Surely, by the mid-1990s, the military budget would shrink because, after all, capitalism had slain the communist dragon. What do we have today? The U.S. military budget is larger than the whole world military budget combined. Now that capitalists no longer had to worry about the communist menace, we might think the role of the Federal Reserve would be smaller because markets would be stable after 1990. Today, 30 years after the reign of market fundamentalists, the Federal Reserve has to pump blood transfusions money on a regular basis into financial markets to keep them from tanking. Would Adam Smith think there might be something wrong with printing more money as an economic policy? We think he would be horrified.
Politically, both major political parties are hated by their populations, with the winning party not being able to attract more than about a third of the vote. More people don't vote than do vote. Has the absence of the Soviet Union and a world socialist threat to the capitalists, not the people of the U.S. at large, brought more people out to vote, I would think that if under capitalism all boats will rise, the voter turnout would be more active because voting is an expression of faith in the system. It hasn't brought more people out to vote. In fact, the Democratic Party, in the wake of the 2016 debacle, developed a conspiracy theory that they lost the elections because of the Russians. But these Russians aren't even communists anymore. You Democratic Party, you can't have an evil red menace if you've already slain the communist menace.
You can if it's an invisible menace.
I guess you can if you're a fucking dumb. Now that the Western free world has triumphantly won over communism, it can set its sights on dealing with the long-term problems, ecological, climatic, infrastructural, and political. Has this happened since the evil Russians were defeated? Capitalists, for whom short-term thinking is natural and endemic, continue to not expand their vision beyond quarterly objectives. They want their assets liquid and ready to move at any time. Is this the economic rationality capitalists are yammering about? Conclusion. The origins of capitalist mythology go back to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. This mythology is told and retold in introductory economic classes at the undergraduate college level. The trouble is, market fundamentalism today is nothing like what Smith argued for. I've exposed 25 myths of Smith's and have been broken by the neoclassical finance monopoly capitalism of today. At the same time, I've tried to show that the socialism of Lenin and Stalin had some commendable qualities as well as shortcomings. Lastly, I've named 12 crises that economies all over the world must face. How well has market fundamentalism solved them since 1990 when it had triumphed over socialism? The answer is that many of the crises have predated the capitalist restoration, but neoliberal capitalism has done nothing to solve them and in most cases made things worse. In addition, some crises are new and broke out after 1990 when market fundamentalism had control. So I ask you, name me one capitalist society that works. Works means it is what Adam Smith promised, a high standard of living not just for the elites but for the middle classes, the working classes, and gradually the poor. A decrease in the amount of work done because of high technology, opportunities for anyone to start a small business who wants to, and a relatively stable economic life. Where is this happening? In the United States, hardly. The standard of living has been declining for 50 years. Germany? Up until about 7 years ago, this claim might have been valid. No more. Japan? They have never recovered from the 1987 crash. Brazil? Possibly for a while under Lula, but no more. Argentina? Decades ago, but not since they were visited by the Chicago Boys, and now buried in debt. It's a similar case as Chile. Western capitalism, all over, is a failure. It is incapable of solving the 12 problems I identified. It is collapsing. Meanwhile, whether we call China state capitalist or socialism with Chinese characteristics, it is clearly becoming a powerhouse. With its infrastructural projects, including the Belt Road Initiative, it is providing selective countries with infrastructure and work. Through its alliance with Russia and Iran, it is helping the besieged socialist countries like Cuba and Venezuela survive the collapse of Western capitalism and the constantly rising imperialist threats. Actually, what this whole section was supposed to be was just an article on black shirts and reds by Michael Parenti, but this was more overall educational, I guess. It just debunks a lot of what capitalists, Republicans, libertarians say all the time. I guess a libertarian would say now is just that all of this stuff, government shouldn't be involved anyway, so there's no problem.
We've made our workers so afraid of technological advancements taking their jobs that the chances of them happening in this capitalistic setup that we currently have are pretty slim to none. Because as a worker, you're terrified that you won't be paid anymore. So you're going to push against anything that could increase production. Like that.
Well, as a worker, you're constantly fending for your job. You're constantly being talked down to, treated like a dog, and
you can't do anything about it.
You can't do anything about it. You can change jobs, but it's basically the same thing.
Oh, you can change jobs?
I mean, if you can change jobs.
Because, like, if you leave your job, if you're currently unhappy with your job and you leave it, at least in America, you're going to have to wait until you can get an interview, hope that you get hired, and then at least here in America, you work 1 to 2 weeks before you start generating any type of a pay. That means you work a week, and then now you have 2 weeks to payday, or you work 2 weeks, and now you have 2 weeks to payday.
Yeah, and then you don't get any vacation or, like, sick days or
like the first year, depending on where you work, depending on loyalty.
And if you do take it, they fucking retaliate against your ass. So, like, What's the point?
Walmart used to offer a week of paid vacation time once you hit your 5-year mark, but they changed that to be 10 years before you got your first week. And every 5 years before that week goes out, and that used to be different too.
It's just
hopeless. It makes...
For the rich, America is great.
That's not very many, though.
Most of us are poor. Most of us don't have great lives. We're just working bare bones and just not thinking about our families. We're thinking about work. And
I think the whole time I've been off work, I haven't thought about, like what I need to do to get better for my health. I've just thought about what do I need to do so I can get back to work.
Yeah.
What Band-Aid can I have so I can go back to work? You don't even have to fix it. Just get me back to work.
You can't prioritize your health over work.
And that's
in this country.
Also, because
and if you do, you're gonna go bankrupt.
I was gonna say,
you're gonna lose your house.
If you lose your job, what happens if you lose your job?
And yeah, if
no health insurance.
And if you try to get on welfare, it's so fucking hard, dude. It's like their websites suck. The questions are repeating over and over again,
and they're meant to be confusing.
They're meant to be confusing. You end up like signing up for the wrong shit. Like, there's no help from the state. There's no help from your employer. There's no help from. Shit sucks for America. For most Americans, shit sucks.